I just found this Ahmadi propaganda right after we said we were talking about it. It's right there on the table. I thought it was interesting. It just appeared today.
Really?
I've never seen this before, but you see the turbans. They apparently converted a lot of African Americans to Islam many years ago in America. I just
I used to teach at the University of Texas at Austin, and they had quite a presence there. They had actually they were quite active also in conversion. But I mean, it's quite interesting because their whole discourse is that this is a true Islam, and they're unlike the Baha'iyya. They don't. It is not a revelation instead of the Quran. It is supposed to be. They define their identity by being a more authentic representation of Islam than everyone else. And it's all type of interesting theological questions, of course, that come up. But I think also I've had an opportunity to read quite a bit about the Ahmadiyya because I did a lot of work in political asylum, and there were a lot of political asylum cases from Pakistan, especially sort of people who represented the Ahmadiyya movement.
I have a question about your discussion before. Yeah, it's interesting to talk about fatwa and the authority of ulama. And in contemporary Egypt, for example, it seems to me that the idea of fatwa and the authority of ulama has much to do with the academic institution also, let's say in Azhar, and because to some extent the professor of Azhar, the sheikh at the University of Azhar is also the jurist and ulama, and when they raise their opinions about one issue, for example, in the case of, as we can see in the case of Abu Zaid and Taha Hussein and Abdul Razak, do you think the academic environment also has been penetrated with the idea of
yeah, I mean, the problem is that the position of the ulama of Azhar is actually far more contestable than a lot of call them liberal secularist Egyptians, for instance, would have you believe. So, for instance, Ali Abdul Razak. It is not. There is no official fatwa by Azhar about Ali Abdul Razak. There was, and his brother continued, Mustafa Abdul Razak, continued to be quite an influential person within Azhar. Ali Abdul Razak's whole clash was really with the government, because at the time the Egyptian king seriously was hoping that after the Khilafah was abolished in Turkey, to declare himself the Khalifa. And when Ali Abdul Razak wrote his treatise, it was like Ibn Taymiyyah treatise on the Khilafah, where he says it's not a theological concept. During the Mongol period, Ali Abdul Razak had in mind to the delegitimation of the king's potential claim to the Khilafah, because it was a very, very live and serious issue. And the persecution that Ali Abdul Razak confronted was, of course, there was cheering by some Azhari sheikhs, but the government itself became the opponent of Ali Abdul Razak, and it was the government itself for its political causes that banned his book and fired him and so on. And at the same time, there were several Azhari sheikhs supported him, and they ended up persecuted as well by the government, although supported by Azhar. Taha Hussein is actually a good case in point, because Taha Hussein, for all what people say about, look, the example of Taha Hussein, ultimately what happens with Taha Hussein? He is a distinguished professor who ends up the dean of the college at Cairo University. He ends up a minister. So for all the people who wrote attacks against his book on Jahiliyyah, which actually is very Orientalist work. I mean, it is or more Orientalist than Orientalists. It is actually proof for the demise of the authority of Azhari sheikhs rather than the opposite, because they ultimately, because there was no wedding of interest between Azhar and the government, as Taha Hussein, he became quite prominent. Until today, Taha Hussein is compared to, for instance, Muhammad Abdu. Taha Hussein is celebrated, and on the occasion of his death, there's always programs on television and so on, while Muhammad Abdu's memory or Rashid Rida's memory is completely buried and destroyed. I mean, there's nothing that, and to the point that even the house of Muhammad Abdu was torn down. But Taha Hussein is considered historical, everything related to Taha Hussein, including his papers and so on. And similarly was Nasr Abu Zaid. Nasr Abu Zaid, the Azhar actually never took a position as to the controversy, and the controversy between, which was by Abdul Sabur Shaheen, the guy who brought the case, he was opposed to Nasr Abu Zaid getting tenure, and there was this rivalry between them and so on. But even in meeting with Nasr Abu Zaid, and after the judgment of the court, the government changed the law that the judge relied on. They saw this as a loophole that in the law, the old law of Hizbah, because it was a law on the books that no one has used for 100 years, and a smart lawyer just dug it up and reasserted it, and the judgment of the court has been criticized severely, including by the Minister of Culture and the Minister of Education, and today Nasr Abu Zaid's wife is a tenured professor at the University of Cairo, and they have been the University of Cairo has tried to get him to go back and he goes in and out of Egypt all the time. So ultimately, even the court judgment itself, the judgment of the that was issued by this judge, there is it was that judgment was taken to a court of called محكمة التنفيذ, the court for enforcement, and they got an court order suspending the enforcement of the judgment of apostasy. And so, and that's where it stands. It's the enforcement is suspended for national interest matters. So there is a clear tendency to, I mean, when you look at the fate of prominent secularists in the history of recent Egypt, the ones who are allowed to appear on television, the ones who are honored, the ones who are promoted within the university and so on, are in fact these secularists, while Islamists are constantly in this back and forth game of being at risk of being arrested and then sometimes tolerated and sometimes but the Azhar, because of its largely ineffective role, the Azhar, from everything from the time of Nasser to Camp David to post Camp David, has been largely irrelevant. Whatever they say, the government, if it likes it, it does it. If it doesn't, it just ignores it. It has created a serious vacuum of authority because, for instance, the Sheikh of Azhar now, Tantawi, is universally looked at as a very corrupt. Sort of reminds me of the popes of 16th and 15th century Europe. Very corrupt and considered a very ignorant person and a very big hypocrite. And but he's there. One of the key things that the Egyptian government, it used to be that the Sheikh of Azhar, the rector of Azhar, was through election by the sheikhs themselves, and the government changed that to by appointment. And Azhar was not even strong enough, although the Sheikh of Azhar at the time opposed that executive decision that said from now on Sheikh of Azhar gets appointed, not elected. They were ineffective to challenge the government, and it's been, so it is very much like a lot of things that have to do with Islam, is that if you go beyond the surface and you start digging up into the facts, you find that in place after place, the reality is still a very post-colonial reality. There has not been a break. A good case in point, Pakistan, for all its quote-unquote Islamizing laws, so-called Islamizing laws are nothing as if it's like Islamizing has become equal to snubbing your nose at the West. But when it comes to matters that the government actually cares about, such as fighting the Taliban or Al-Qaeda and so on, well, how many thousands of Muslims have died in this ongoing war in the mountains against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and so on. Is the clergy in Pakistan effective? They don't like it, but can change it? They haven't been unable to change it. And they've been unable to change it from consecutive rulers. The government at times will, in example after example, will accept certain so-called Islamization symbols, not interestingly generated by the traditional clergy, but generated by Jama'at Islamiyya, by the Islamic fundamentalist groups. And it does so in the most, what can I say, distorted fashion. I mean, so what it cares about is the appearance of Islamic compliance, but once there is a discourse about power instead of doctrine. Before we get to the government's claim that its laws are Islamic, let's first get an autonomous discourse going, so we can have a free discourse about what is Islamic or what is Sharia. Here, the whole dynamic breaks down. Here you invariably end up clashing with these various governments. So, the hold of, yes, religion is important, but at the same time, the reality has been that the act of intervention and strict regulation of religious discourse by these despots seen as dictators who, you look back, most of them came to power either through the West or through the communist bloc, and have existed since then with a great deal of repression. To what extent do we see any, can we say, authentic Islamic expression of anything? I think, and as long as the dynamics remains polarized between sort of either the Puritan versus the secular, it's either one extreme or another. You never have something that negotiates the middle. And so the issue of authenticity is quite derailed from the beginning. I mean, ironically, if you look at many of the reform thinkers within Iran, here you find a very rich theological, philosophical, juristic tradition, but consistently that ends up clashing with the government. And it's quite amazing how rich the discourse that has arisen independent from the government in Iran, among Muslim theologians and jurists. Another rich example, again, ironically, is Turkey. The whole school of Mursi Said and his students and so on, and the times where you find serious derailment of this discourse of moderation is when you have an intervention by the military, again, to prevent a natural sociological and cultural processes to take place. I mean, consistently, the reality has been, in the age of modernity, is the intervention of military and foreign interests in the public square, and the regulation of the public square by security forces, by force. And to what extent then the public square becomes representative of anything authentic really becomes it's like, you know, to what extent do we have anything authentic when when compulsion exists or coercion exists, when there's ikrah? Can we say that anything is really a true expression of anything? This is the you know, civil society in the pre-modern period and pre-Ottoman period, but even well into the 16th century, civil society, I mean, for all the attempt of the central government by the Ottomans to colonize the public space, they were not able to enforce or force Muslims within the empire to adopt the Hanafi school. I mean, the Shafi'i school, Maliki school thrived, consistently, Islam and Islamic juristic discourses thrived, and the judicial system thrived in the public square as long as it had a level of autonomy from those in power. And that's why you find a very old discourse in Islamic theology and law about how corrupting power is, right? And you know, and the refusal of some of the many prominent jurists in Islam to accept even a judicial position. And you know, we find these traditions all over the place. You know, such jurist was persecuted and so because he refused to accept even a judicial position, even when, and what again, some of the tradition that Wahhabis don't like is when jurists say, okay, we'll accept the position on the condition that even if we order the Khalifa to appear in our court, he has to submit. And we have tons of traditions like that. I mean, and different rulers negotiate this in different ways. Some by strict oppression, some by so on. But ultimately, it is this public sphere when it is intervened with violently, is that where the mechanisms of church-free Islamic theology, you know, the Islamic theology from the beginning, which rejected the kahanut and the notion of a human being having the power, the ultimate power of absolution or lack of it, and has even within the Shia world, which ultimately accepted that the Imam is ghaib and is not present and is has it depend it's say that it depended for, it's not just authenticity but for thriving on culture and society, not on power. And whenever it became dependent on power, we see all types of mechanisms. Because if you even know the epistemology of Islamic law itself, or the epistemology of Islamic theology, it cannot work if power, brute force, is what is directing it or regulating it or ultimately so in order for this epistemology to even work at all, the idea of schools of thoughts and different jurisdictions and the autonomy of conscience and the individual accountability and all of that, and that is why the influence of jurists throughout Islamic history has always been persuasive. It is not a compulsory authority, but it has always been persuasive authority. They and the reason that they were targeted by colonialism so distinctly is because they initially led the rebellion against colonialism. The whole resistance movement against colonial powers was led by and not by those in power. Often colonialism married itself, like today United States and the rulers of Saudi Arabia, married itself with those in power, gave them a share of the cake, and they created an incestuous, corrupt relationship between colonial powers and the local rulers. Who rose in rebellion? It was the religious leadership. And that is also why Orientalist tradition is very hostile to the autonomy of the space, because many of the Orientalists who came along to facilitate the colonization of Muslims, they were producing discourses designed to delegitimate the role of resistance to colonialism and the role of the jurists who ultimately were leading the masses in these resistance. I mean, in the invasion of France and the bombardment of Azhar, you see this, and the mass. One of the sad episodes of execution of about 130 something Azhari sheikhs by Napoleonic French forces, and it was some of them, not some of them, it was really the cream of the crop that was executed, and it was for, and then British colonialism again, it went after. People like Nadim and the genesis of people like Muhammad Abdu and or of course more famously Al-Afghani and so on. They combined the thought of a renaissance that is tradition that founds itself, that rests its legitimacy on the continuation of the Islamic tradition, but resisting the colonizer and resisting the despotic power that is in collusion with the colonizer. Now, of course, that was quite I mean, we have very short memories, because you read in history and you find that this was a very bloody battle. I mean, when you look at the rebellions, whether in Sudan or in Egypt or in Iraq or in Syria or in leave alone, in Afghanistan and so on, you find that it took a lot of blood to get the traditional leaders of the public space to abandon the role and to learn to accept the political reality as a given. And I think when I mean, it was an Orientalist idea to support the Wahhabis as the real Islam. Initially, it was. I mean, and I have to. I mean, I wrote a part of it, the history of Wahhabism and the Great Theft, but I want to write a separate book on it, because you find that it was initially. It originated with British Orientalists that told the government these people look to us like they're intolerant, they're extremely Bedouin-like, they're our image of what a Muslim is. And then the remarkable thing is the Roosevelt administration, at the same time that we are talking about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and so on, in typical fashion, like the deal with Palestine, or like the division of the Middle East between France and Britain.